You are about to experience Jackson Snyder Presents. Direct from the Vero Essene Yahad, a Hebrew Nation radio original program. JSP is a variety show seeking out Jewish and Christian origins, religion, theology and history, and doing so in a fashion that is both educational and entertaining. Welcome to Jackson Snyder Presents.
Here's an excerpt from The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Jewish Origins of Christianity by Carsten Peter Thiede, beginning on page 212. The Essenes who became obedient to the faith did not come empty-handed. In a fledgling movement which was beginning to shape its own structures, their expertise and traditions were as welcome as, for example, Hellenistic elements provided by the Circle of Stephen, or Pharisaic learning, which came from Paul, and yet nothing was merely copied. The first Christian communities were no epigones. As we have seen again and again, vital ingredients cannot be traced to any Essene source whatsoever. Sometimes, as with Ananias and Sapphira, the model was surpassed. Sometimes much less was said or done. Details of parables in the Gospels, which were anything but mysterious to contemporary hearers and readers, can be understood more fully because of scroll fragments which tell us how Jews at the time of Jesus interpreted ancient prophecies or observations of daily life. And technical terms, misunderstood or misdated for a long time, can be seen in their true light. One particularly important example is the office of episkopos, the overseer of the community, which etymologically is the origin of the term bishop. It has been interpreted as a comparatively late title of office in the church, yet its model is anything but late. It can be traced back to the Essene Mevaker, or guardian, of the Damascus document. One of the most pious Jews in the early Jerusalem community, James, the brother of the Lord, who was killed in AD 62, was the first example of such a Mevaker episkopos, at least in the 20 years after the departure of Peter from Jerusalem in AD 41. And it was a famous Protestant scholar, not a Roman Catholic, who asked whether James was perhaps really the first pope, in the sense of a monarchical episcopate which originated in Jerusalem and spread via the Jewish Christian communities. Suggestions such as these may be controversial, but they open new avenues. Suddenly, supposedly late Christian developments, second or third generation structures, and hierarchical orders begin to look ancient and Jewish, part and parcel of the Jewish roots of Christianity. We know from the history of the Church that the Jewish Christian wing eventually lost its influence and authority throughout the Roman Empire, and the rivalry between different bishoprics became a constant and lasting source of irritation. Even in the 4th century, Emperor Constantine could not rely on any first among equals, let alone a pope in the medieval and modern sense, when he convened the Council of Nicaea. But it was not least the strength of the position held by the local or regional bishop, the Mevaker episkopos, which led to such tensions. One community's Jerusalem, while another community's Antioch, or Athens, or Rome. Neither the Damascus document, nor Paul in his letters, nor James claimed that there was one bishop above all other bishops. The overseers were in charge of camps, or branches of the overall community. In the hierarchical structure of the Essenes, one such guardian was set over a camp with other men, from highest to least, in charge of special tasks and duties. If, for the sake of the argument, we regard the Christian community in a city like Philippi as a camp, we recognize a difference over and against the similarities. An Essene camp has one Mevaker, but Paul speaks of more than one episkopos at Philippi. Thus, once again, even a useful form of hierarchical structure was not simply imitated by the Christians. It was applied and adjusted according to their specific needs. The hierarchical structure reappears in 1 Timothy. There is a hierarchy of bishops above deacons, but again, there is no hierarchy among the bishops. Remarkably, though, bishops are supposed to be married with children, which conforms to the traditional image of a rabbi, or indeed any Jew for that matter, but conflicts with the special celibate status of the Essene priestly hierarchy, Jesus and Paul himself. As for James, who was married, according to 1 Corinthians 9:5, he exercised his authority beyond Jerusalem, but did not act entirely on his own. The so-called Apostolic Council in Jerusalem, which paved the way for a concentrated mission among non-Jews, according to Acts 15, 1-30, was teamwork and would have been impossible without Peter's decisive opening address, a speech which is remarkable, a remarkable case of early Christian leadership and diplomacy, that is, Acts 15, 7-11. James, in turn, quotes Amos 9, 11-12, and he does so in a form which is close to two Qumran texts, the 4Q Florilegium 1, 10-12, and the Damascus document 7:16. And like those two Qumran fragments, James links the prophecy of Amos with another prophecy, 2 Samuel 7:13. The most remarkable aspect of this rare use of Amos is in its strategy. James does not reject the pagans. On the contrary, he invites them into the fold under the promise given to the house of David, of which, of course, he, like Jesus, was a member by direct lineage. After this I will return, and will rebuild the tent of David which is fallen. From its ruins I will rebuild it, and I will set it up, so that all peoples may seek Yahweh, even all the Gentiles over whom my name has been called. Thus says Yahweh, who has been making these things known from long ago. And he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. 2 Samuel 7:13. Compare this with 4Q 174, 10-12. Yahweh declares to you that he will build a house for you. I will raise up your seed after you. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. He is the branch of David. I will raise up the tent of David, which is fallen. That is to say, the fallen tent of David is he who shall arise to save Israel. In a separate incident, even Paul has to understand the authority of James was that a true overseer who relied on trusted colleagues, concerned that Paul was doing too much too soon at Antioch, disrupting the sensitive equilibrium of Jewish and Gentile believers, he sent messengers to Peter who took swift action and reassured the Jewish Christian community by eating with them rather than with the Gentiles, according to Galatians 2:14. Paul himself, at the receiving end of these measures, was less than pleased, and his depiction of the scene is as frank as it is understandably one-sided. Even so, Paul admitted that Barnabas, the experienced diplomat of the early church who knew Antioch well, sided with Peter, and in a later letter, Paul himself pronounced the careful balance maintained by James, Peter, and Barnabas. To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, though I am not free from the law of Elohim, but am under Messiah's law, so that I might win those outside the law. 1 Corinthians 9, 20 and 21. No less a theologian than Tertullian, A.D. 180-220, was the first to see that Paul had learned from the Antioch incident. In the end, the overseer's message and Peter's action had been beneficial to all concerned, a far-reaching example of the Mivaker Episkopos structure at work during the early stages of Jewish and Gentile mission before the death of James in A.D. 62 and the destruction of Jerusalem in A.D. 70. Adding to these credentials, the New Testament letter of James has recently been reattributed to the historical apostle after decades of doubts about its authorship and date. With the authority of someone who is confident enough to address all 12 tribes in the diaspora, James 1:1, James admonishes and strengthens his readers, and he does so in a language which is often reminiscent of the community scroll, 1QS. If James reckoned with people among the recipients of his epistle who knew the message of the 1QS document, his parallels would have been particularly poignant. James and the followers of Yahshua in Jerusalem, like so many other Jews, knew about the writings and teachings of the Essenes, as they also knew about those of other Jewish groups of their time. And they not only knew the teachings, they knew the people themselves. As we saw before, Essenes, Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, and the others did not live in convents. They could be met almost anywhere, and one passage in the book of Acts may indicate that Essene priests even joined the first Christian community in Jerusalem. Conversions from one distinctive Jewish group to another were not unheard of. Paul was perhaps the most famous example, the Pharisee who became a follower of Yahshua HaMashiach. Other Pharisees became Jewish Christians before and after Paul, according to Acts 15:5. Acts 6:7 mentions a great many of the priests who became obedient to the faith. It is obvious that these many priests cannot have been Sadducees, members of the priestly movement who refused, as we saw above, the basic starting point of a debate about Yahshua as the crucified and risen Messiah, the belief in a resurrection. The Pharisees did not even have a sizable priesthood from which many priests could have been converted. This leaves us with the Essenes, that messianic, eschatological, and priestly community. Essene converts, still Essenes by training, as much as the Pharisaic followers of Jesus did not join a new religion or church, but an inner Jewish messianic movement to begin with, could have helped to get the scrolls, which were found in Cave 7, to the study library of Qumran, but conversely, they would have shared their knowledge and interpretation of Scripture and some of their scrolls, and with other messianic Jews. The allusions to Essene thought in James' speech of Acts 15 and in chapter 3 of his letter could easily have been inspired by this very special new target group. In fact, a particularly intriguing present that the Essene Christians would have brought with them was the combination of a fervent, immediate messianic hope and the urge to write about it. Some New Testament scholars think the first Christians did not write about Yahshua until the second generation or so, that is, in the 70s and 80s of the first century, when Yahshua still had not returned. But the Qumran evidence tells us that the opposite scenario is true. A fervently messianic, eschatological Jewish movement does not meditate quietly until the final day dawns or disappointment sets in and writing becomes a kind of therapy. On the contrary, they write immediately, fast, and efficiently, so that other Jews can share in their beliefs before it's too late. The first Jewish Christians would not have survived long among such Jews if they had not followed suit, put pen to paper, and told others about Yahshua. The origins of this literary tradition are not late. They are, of necessity, very early indeed, and parallel the oral tradition itself. Even the strategy of preserving the message of one's teacher, not just the community's interpretation of biblical prophecies, etc., was part of this approach. At Qumran, 6, perhaps more different copies of 4Q MMT, that's the works of the Torah, supposedly written by the teacher of righteousness, have been found. Given such an example virtually next door, it's inconceivable that the messianic, eschatologically minded followers of the teacher Yahshua would have left his words and deeds to the literary endeavors of later communities, a generation or two after their own time. Peter, first among equals and James' supporter at the Apostolic Council, and the other original 12 disciples had been aware of real-life Essenes before James joined the believers. Some scholars are even convinced that the Last Supper took place in an Essene guest house. The characteristics are striking. Yahshua tells Peter and John to prepare the paschal lamb in a room that they will find by following a man with a jar of water. Water in jars was carried by women. If men carried water, they were, as a rule, slaves who transported it in skins. Here, however, is a man who carried a jar. This appears to suggest that he belonged to a community without slaves and without women. Only one Jewish community in Jerusalem met these criteria, the Essenes. The Essene guest house in Jerusalem would not be surprising, and the possibility that Yahshua used it looks sound and practical. No one who stays at Ramadan Hotel today is by definition a Muslim, nor are all guests of the popular YMCA Hotel in Jerusalem Christians. Practical considerations abound, and the use of the Essene solar calendar, later developed into the solar-lunar one, rather than that of the lunar calendar of the Pharisees and Sadducees, may have been another of these down-to-earth decisions. The Essenes at Qumran even had their own subtle sundial, only recently discovered among the finds kept by the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem. Today, the analysis of the different calendar systems in use at the time of Yahshua may help us to synchronize the different chronologies of the Passover week and the Last Supper. But even this does not turn Yahshua or a gospel author into followers of the Essenes. Israel's leading English-language newspaper, the Jerusalem Post, has 3 dates on its front page. First, the Christian date, then the Jewish date, and finally the Islamic date. But no one doubts that it is a Jewish newspaper published by Jews in Israel, and the date, as such, is the same. Real progress is most tangible in those many unspectacular cases where words or idioms suddenly illuminate a saying, or an action requires a meaningful context thanks to a Hebrew or Aramaic usage of a Dead Sea Scroll. The examples of kahal and its Greek equivalent, ekklesia, for a structured community, highlighting the fact that the historical Yahshua could easily have spoken about a church, to use the modern etymological derivative in Matthew 16:18, was one such example. The mivaker episkopos, for the overseer of the community, was another. Sometimes a whole verse loses its mystique. Generations of Christians have been brought up with the angel's message to the shepherds in the Nativity story. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill towards men. Others in the Roman Catholic tradition heard about peace to men of goodwill, based on the Latin Vulgate, or peace on earth and favor towards men, based on certain manuscripts and favored since Luther's translation among the Reformers. The Thanksgiving hymns from Qumran Cave 1 know the Hebrew expression as men of God's good pleasure. These people are the object of divine predilection, and Luke can best be understood in this sense: peace upon earth among men of good will. It would be too much to claim that Greek writing Luke copied a Hebrew Essene idiom, but what the Qumran scroll does achieve is a textual clarification. It was like this that Jews at the time of Yahshua could speak about the will of Elohim for his faithful. Insights of this kind will result in the years to come, when all the scrolls, including the smallest fragments, will be scrutinized for their language, vocabulary, style, and idiom.
You have been listening to Jackson Snyder Presents on Hebrew Nation Radio.